Hello everyone, today we're doing something slightly different for the channel. I'm joined by Barrie, also known as that man from SETI Alpha 5. Go subscribe to him on YouTube, and we are counting down our top 5 war movies of all time. Now, one thing I suppose we should do is just explain a little bit what we consider a war movie. For example, I do really like the film Bridge on the River Kwai, but I have not included it because I kind of felt that a war movie should have some sort of battle scene in it to qualify as a war film. Something like The Great Escape, which would definitely be on this list, I would say is more like a prison or a prisoner of war film and not an actual war film. So how did you come to decide? What were your criteria, Barrie?
Okay, well, it was more a case of I grew up watching war films and westerns with my dad. And when I got home from school in the 80s, there wasn't really much on TV. I mean, there was only 4 channels in those days. For any younger viewers, I should just explain that if you grew up in the 80s and 90s, you had 4 channels, and that was it. There was no satellite, there was no cable until the late 90s.
It was 3 at one point. Channel 4 came in the 80s.
Yeah, I think it's more to enjoyment and engagement with what I'm watching. I mean, there's some great war films. There's Bridget Remagen, but it's kind of like a fictional version of a true story. Whereas The Great Escape is a true story. And if you read the book by Paul Brickhill, he was one of the escapers. He was actually in Stalag Luft 3, and he also wrote one of my choices for one of my picks. He wrote The Dam Busters, and Guy Gibson wrote Enemy Coast Ahead. The thing is, I think, and this is also true with the actors, if they came from that generation and they actually served, it makes the film feel more real because they know how to march, they know how to speak, they know how to address the superior and all that sort of thing. If you look at, say, I don't know, Extraction with Chris Hemsworth, it's a good film, it's an enjoyable film, but he's never served, and you can tell just the way he speaks and the way he acts is just wrong. And you compare that with somebody like Richard Todd in The Dam Busters, and the way he carries himself and the way he speaks is just absolutely perfect because he was actually at Pegasus Bridge on D-Day. So he was there, he saw it, he'd been through that training, he'd been through all of that kind of thing. And you just know that, I mean, even if you watch the first round of Bond films with Sean Connery, he served, he was in the Royal Navy. So it's that realism that I want. I can't watch something later on like Extraction or even Jarhead because the actors, they just don't feel real. And you can tell that.
I agree with you because one of my picks, I mean, quite a lot of my picks are picked because they're sort of enjoyable, even if they're not portraying war in any way in a positive light, but they are still enjoyable films. Well, one of them, which when we get to, is like I picked it deliberately because it is that attempt to shatter the John Wayne sort of war film portrayal, to show how it really was. But if we start with one that I don't know if it's really possible to judge how realistic it is, which is my 5th pick, and I have gone for Zulu with Michael Caine. And we're talking about a war film, but it's not a recent war. But again, it has that, it's kind of sanitized, I think, and particularly sanitizes the opposition. It very much is a focus on the British as they fight that battle. But it also does have things that, like the burning of the hospital and things like that, that are kind of gritty. There's a grittier edge for its time, which I think it sets it apart for that era as well. So I really enjoyed Zulu. I think it is strangely enough for the fun factor of it, which is a horrible thing to say about so many people dying, but that's one of those ones that I watched as a kid and was just like, this is a lot of spectacle, and that's why I kind of was like, yep, this is the one for me. Have you seen Zulu?
I think the realism I have seen Zulu. It's one of my favourites. I think the reason why it's surreal is because Stanley Baker and Michael Caine and Jack Hawkins, again, all served. And because they actually respected the original story, it's, just for anybody who's not sure, it's the Battle of Rorke's Drift. It was during the Zulu Wars of the late 19th century. It was basically 150 British soldiers versus 4,000 Zulus. And it's an absolutely true story if you want to go and read it. It was led by a guy called Lieutenant John Chard, who was the head of the unit at the time, who in the film was played by Stanley Baker. And what happened was they were on duty, they were on guard, and the Zulus came and attacked them.
They were outnumbered. I mean, like ridiculously. The idea that anyone would have to sort of go through that, even though they did have slight technological advantage, obviously with guns and things, but it's still a minuscule amount of people to face the odds that they did. And that again is something that I'll come back to in my other picks, is that sort of scrappy underdog thing is a big part in enjoying or it's not necessarily enjoying, but appreciating a war movie for what it is. I don't want to give too much away about my second pick, but that's definitely something that I want to come back to when we get to that pick, like the difference between almost the true story and like the Hollywood version of it. But the Rorke's Drift one, I think, like you say, they did attempt, which again at the time, you know, you have a lot of the John Wayne films like Bang Bang, people falling down. They did, I think, try to tell in this instance, at least the true story.
If you watch something like the Green Berets, it's very obvious that it's kind of like, hey, we're American, we're here to save the world sort of thing. And it's like, no, that's not the way war goes.
Yeah, like a propaganda movie rather than any sort of true story movie. The difference there, I think. Yeah.
Yes. And of course, Stanley Baker and all those guys. Stanley Baker actually produced that film, and he produced Robbery, which is another great film, and he also produced The Innocent Bystanders and starred in it. But he died really young. He was only about 45 when he passed away. And I thought he was a better actor than Sean Connery.
Right, okay. He's got charisma and presence rather than brilliant acting chops. So, but yeah, charisma and presence.
He's a presence, and he just does the same thing all the time. You know, today we sail into history, and it's the same as that, as in The Untouchables, as in James Bond, as in The Rock. He plays the same character every time. My fifth choice is The Cruel Sea, which came out in 1953. Have you ever seen that film?
I have. I watched it about 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So that was the first time I've seen it.
Really?
Yeah.
But yeah, just to give a bit of context, The Cruel Sea is based on the Atlantic convoys going between America and Britain. It takes place on a little corvette, smaller than a destroyer, bigger than a patrol boat, called the Compass Rose. And they have to escort the convoys, avoid the U-boats, and so on. The book is actually better than the film. It's basically 5 or 6 short stories covering a different year in the war and what they've learned and how they go about doing that. And, you know, the experience they get from hunting U-boats and stuff. It's like the scene in the film where they detect the U-boat and it's right underneath the merchant sailors who are in the sea. That just absolutely grabs you instantly, because they know the U-boat's there. He's got the choice. He has to say, you know, are we going to attack this U-boat with these guys in the water? Is he going to bomb his own guys? And then he says, we have to attack this U-boat. And Jack Hawkins is fantastic in that film. And he's fantastic in that moment afterwards, because afterwards you see the sailor and he's going, you bloody murderer. That was the first time the word bloody was actually used on film.
Really?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, it's from like 1953 or something, so it never occurred to me that. But yeah, when you think about it, it makes a lot of sense that would be the first instance of it. But I have to say that as you're watching the film, that part of it is particularly powerful, because you just can't believe, for the era of the film you're watching and the story that you've seen to that point, that he would actually do that. And it's probably the only bit in the film where it has that level of suspense, that will he, won't he do that? And when he did, I was like wow, because I just did not expect that in a 1953 movie. It's so close to the end of the war, to show something that's not completely heroic really shocked me. And I thought, as you say, the performance afterwards, you can see like him struggling to deal with the decision that he made. I have to say in general that the film, I felt personally that it tried to do too much. And there's a bit that you mentioned there briefly, which is when the ship breaks down in the water and there's U-boats all around them, and they're completely stranded and trying to repair the engines, but doing so in a really quiet way so they don't attract the U-boats. And I thought that part alone would have been a movie on its own of such extraordinary tension that it would have been thoroughly brilliant. So there's all this other stuff which is good, but I just thought that bit I would have loved to have seen almost at 90 minutes of its own. So.
That scene is actually just one chapter in the book. I think it's 1942, and it really goes into detail, like we've got to use the rubber hammer rather than the metal one, so it won't make as much noise. We've got to make sure that the depth charge rail is locked down and it's not going to roll and all that sort of stuff. Any kind of sound is going to pick up on those U-boat scanners. And when you read the book, it's like, oh, are they really going to get out of this? There's a really similar film, actually, that I want to mention called The Enemy Below, and it's got Robert Mitchum in it. The book is actually set on a British destroyer. It's kind of like a condensed version of The Cruel Sea. It's basically a hunt between the destroyer and the U-boat. It's kind of like the end of Wrath of Khan, when the Enterprise and the Reliance are in the nebula, and they're trying to outmaneuver each other, and they're trying to guess each other's next move. It's got Kurt Jurgens, who is in Spy Who Loved Me, is the villain in that.
Right.
That's a great film. And yeah, that one keeps you guessing and keeps you on the edge of your seat. I remember seeing that one as a kid too.
I might look out for that one. I don't know if I've seen that, but yeah, The Cruel Sea for a 1953 movie is extraordinary. It wouldn't make mine simply because war movies are made with better technology now, but you can't fault things like the performances. And like I said, I felt that the story, because it does so much, because it takes across like 4 or 5 years and 3 or 4 different ships. So I felt like for a film, for a book it would work better, but for a film it would be better just to focus on like 1 or 2 of those instances, or perhaps play liberties with the book a little bit and sort of combine them. But yeah, it's still a really good film.
Yeah, absolutely. And the scene that always stood out for me was the scene where at the sonar, and he's giving his orders, and the guy's making tuk tuk noises. He says, "Stop making that noise now." And that is just so right. I just like that so much because, still in discipline. And again, that's something missing from modern films. You just don't get that kind of, get in line sort of thing.
Yeah, there is. I think the portrayal of life on the ships is actually pretty good. But I was a little disappointed from a dramatic point of view only that the original second in command was written out, because he seemed like a complete and utter bastard. And I was like, this could be a lot of fun. But then they write him out sort of before it gets any further. I guess that's part of that short story, being that first short story probably was about him, and then he wasn't in the others, which is a bit of a shame because he was a great character.
Yeah. He was, and again, he was young Stanley Baker who played that character in the film. And again, in the book, he disappears after the first chapter.
Shame. Some of the stuff that it took the time to show, like the shore leave and how sort of the personal lives were being affected by being at war as well. And I thought that was like a nice touch, because again, we're talking about 1953. It's only 8 years after the war. There's still this need, I think, to sanitize and promote the heroism rather than show. Actually, there were some really quite negative sides to this.
What's your choice?
Well, this one might be it'll probably be on a lot of people's top 5s, but I'm willing to bet that it's lower on mine than most people would put it, and it is Saving Private Ryan. I don't think many people would dispute that it's a top quality war film. The reason that it's on mine, again, spectacle, characters, like the realism of the D-Day landing and things like that is right up there. The one thing that for me is a little bit, you don't want to call it a misstep because it's such a great film and such a great sequence, but that D-Day landing is so spectacular that nothing that comes after it can live up to it. And if you look at the way that Spielberg makes us care about the characters that build up that unit, to see them going through the things on D-Day together, having that relationship with them would have made it even more powerful. I know you can't lose parts of the story. It has to be told in that sequence, but it's just, it could have been, I don't know, just like so amazing to see them do that together, and having built up a little bit like Band of Brothers, you get that sort of 8-hour 8 hours with those characters rather than just the two, and then the D-Day landing on Saving Private Ryan. It's immediate. It's right at the start. So
yes,
it's still a great film. I do love the performances of it. I like, like Matt Damon, and particularly the old guy that plays the character in the graves at the end, sort of crying about it. It's sort of like, there's real emotional heart to that film. It's a really fitting tribute to what was done on particularly on D-Day, but also following.
Agreed on the first sort of half hour, 45 minutes. Fantastic. I mean, fantastic not in a way that is entertaining, but it just really puts you in the middle of it. And you just end up thinking, this is somewhere I would not want to be ever. And these guys just have to go and do it. And, most of them paid with their lives. And it does kind of bring it home to you, the reality of it. And you just think, ooh.
Yeah,
this is not good.
One thing that struck me about it was a couple of years after it came out, I actually met a Royal Marine Commando who by this time was like, I suspect probably 90 years old or getting towards it. And this guy was 5'6". He was skinny as a rake. And you think, how did this guy do the things that generation had to do, particularly a Royal Marine Commando? And you're just like, at that point, I'm 30, probably in the best shape of my life, and I'm just like thinking, I could not do the things that this small, unassuming man has done. Yeah, actually, like a genuine, proper hero, and it's like really humbling to be in the presence of somebody like that, and then see that film sort of just bringing home. They're just ordinary guys, just doing a really horrible job, really difficult job. It's quite powerful.
Yeah. I find the second half of that film, though, to be a little bit kind of Spielbergish, if that's the right word to use. It's a little bit kind of, we've got to go and find this guy because that sort of thing. That sort of thing didn't really happen at all. But it's like the final fight when Vin Diesel gets killed, and he's, that is pretty harrowing. The similar film to that is The Longest Day. Of course, that's got everybody and their uncle in it.
Yeah,
it's a very kind of Hollywood version of it, but it tells the story reasonably well. But yeah, Saving Private Ryan's a much better film. There's actually a film I want to mention called Devotion. It's based on a book. It's about two real guys, and it's set in the Korean War, and it's a true story. It's about the first black Marines aviator and his wingman. And I don't want to reveal too much in case people want to go and see it, but it's a great book and a great, and
second opinion.
That's her favorite, and I totally agree with it. It is a great film. It's got the guy who was in Top Gun Maverick, who's a little bit cocky as his wingman, and Jonathan Majors. He's really good in that film.
Let's move on to your number 4.
Number 4 for me is Full Metal Jacket.
Okay.
Okay, so I actually saw this film with my dad. Now, I should just explain, my dad was an RSM. He was a tank commander, and he served for 20-odd years, and he was served all over the place. He did not like that film because one of his jobs as an RSM was to train the new lads. And we got to the first advert break, and he was just going like this throughout the whole first act of the film. And I turned to him and I said, Dad, what's the matter? And he said, he should be court-martialed and thrown out, that sergeant, because that is not the way you treat the lads at all. You hard with them, you push them, but you don't bully people, and you certainly don't put one person out and take the nick out of them. No, because at the end of the day, you're a unit, you're a family, you get exactly. And he said, you don't bully people like that. If there's a problem with the guy, take him to one side and say, you're not up to snuff, and then show him the door in a quiet way. Don't get the lads to beat him with a sock full of soap. No, it just wouldn't happen. And he actually called it. He said, that's going to send him over the edge. And of course it did. It's kind of a bit of a strange film to watch because the first 45 minutes is them training under Hartman. And again, it comes back to the realism of Arleone was a gunnery sergeant, so he knew how to act and how to behave and how to march. The second half of the film is kind of a bit strange. Yes, they're on duty. It's kind of like Platoon, but Platoon does it a lot better.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it was all filmed in London's Docklands because Stanley Kubrick didn't want to go to the Far East or something.
Yeah, he won't fly. So he's afraid of flying, so he wouldn't go. So they filmed it in London. But the funny thing is that people talk about Ali Amri's performance as the drill sergeant, which is, incredible, and obviously he has experience to build on. But if you read the book, and I'm talking about the book by Gustav Hasford, not the one, the other one, the Dispatches, I can't remember who that's by. If you read Short Timers by Gustav Hasford, it's word for word the script to the book. It's incredibly similar. And you go, okay, so as much as the performance, and people say, oh, he ad-libbed this and that, it's like, what did he ad-lib? Because in fact, it's so incredibly similar. You go, I'm not sure how much was ad-libbed and how much was just copied. However, Hasford, no longer with us, and had issues when he was with us, significantly with drug abuse and things like that. And as a result of a very difficult time with the army, but he did apparently base that on his own experiences. So we don't know for sure. I haven't found anyone willing to corroborate just how much of that bullying of Private Pile was legit or not, but a lot of it is in the book. And the second half of the book is slightly more coherent than the second half of the film, but is still very similar. It's just the film had nothing like the money that they needed. There's a bit in the book with a sniper and a call in the tank, and it just blows up one building. And the sniper's not in there, so it just blows up the next one. And the sniper's in there, so it blows up the next one. So clearly they're not going to do that. That's just really wasteful in terms of dramatics and budget for a film. So they're not going to do that. But it is a slightly more coherent book. And I do have quite a bit of trouble with my review of Dispatches, in that I really did not like Dispatches. And most of the comments and the dislike ratio on my review of it is it does me no credit, and the comments generally don't do me a lot more credit either. But I really did not like Dispatches, because for me, Gustav Hasford's book is about, well, the film is based on it. It's just so very similar. To say it's not based on it is ridiculous. And Gustav Hasford's book is about the soldiers and what they went through, and Dispatches is much more about the journalist who wrote it, Michael Hare. Does that sound right? You probably
think so. Yeah.
He seems to be like, look at the terrible things I went through, and then he'll write a chapter about how he was in this 5-star French colonial hotel miles from the action. It's like, you really suffered, didn't you? So I kind of I had the hump with him rather than the book, and I think that the review of it is a little bit coloured by that. But I also have the hump with anyone that says that Full Metal Jacket is based on Dispatches, because it just isn't. There's about 3 lines in Dispatches that you can go, oh, that influenced something in the film, but there's really nothing else. And I think that Hasford's book is a masterpiece. It really is wonderful and doesn't get anything like the credit it deserves. But the book, and this is the film. This is supposed to be a video about the film. I really do enjoy the film, but I wouldn't have it on my top 5, but it'd certainly be in that sort of bubbling under part, because the performances are strong, and it's just a really different look at things, But it's a shame there's a lot of stuff in the book that would have made really great cinema, but doesn't quite make it in.
I think the thing is, for me, it was kind of immersive. You've got a real good feel of what it was like, and then when they're out in the battlefield and you actually see these people, and there's of course the scene at the end with the little girl who's the sniper. That's actually really similar as that scene in the Bridget Remagen when the little boy's in the top of the hotel and he's one of the Hitler Youth, and it's got that kind of, the way it's framed is very similar as well. And of course, the look of disgust on Ben Gazzara's face when he shoots the little boy is exactly the same as when they've got the Joker has to shoot the little girl at the end. You can just see he's like, I really don't want to do this because this is a little girl, but at the end of the day, I've got to do this. Yeah. That's what I liked.
It's a weird sort of war, isn't it, Vietnam, in that you have like the war in Europe, World War II, is like men against men. But again, but when it got to Vietnam, it was like men that really didn't want to be there. Some of them were conscripted for the Americans, and they are fighting against literally everybody. That everybody is involved in, because fighting for their homes, and they're kind of less organised than you might say of a typical military, apart from the NVA, of course. But it's just chaos, and it really does Kubrick's film does capture some of that, but because it's so obviously not Vietnam. The set dressing is good, but it's so obviously not Vietnam that where the film is being shot. And so there's just films that do that last part of it better. But the bit with the for all the lack of realism that was pointed out, whether it was real or not, because we don't know for what Hasford said, but your father clearly didn't like it much. That first part of that film, up to the death of Private Power, I would say that's a masterpiece. That is just a pure 5 out of 5. There's not a misstep there in terms of cinema or entertainment. It's just a wonderful part of the film.
Yeah. It's kind of a bit of a weird schizophrenic film because you've got that whole build-up, and then when you actually get onto it, he's basically sitting around and he says, well, you're a journalist, go and write something. So, well, this is not kind of what I was expecting. And then when he actually gets onto the battlefield, and he sees it for real when it's not Raptor Man, it's Baldwin brother, and he's absolutely crazy with the machine gun, and then he gets killed.
Yeah.
And that's when the reality hits him. Where it was filmed was actually exactly the same place as For Your Eyes Only at the start with the helicopter.
All right.
It's Becton Gas Works. All the buildings are exactly the same.
Yeah.
So when James Bond's flying around in the helicopter, those are the exact same buildings in Full Metal Jacket.
It would be a bad thing for your immersion in the film if you were starting to recognise landmarks and things, I think. But they did a pretty good job of dressing it up, but it's just, it's never going to completely convince. It's a shame, really, that Kubrick couldn't or wouldn't fly, because with his attention to detail, that second half would have been very different if he was able to go out to Vietnam.
Yeah. What's your next choice then, sir?
Well, funnily enough, given that we just talked about Vietnam for a little while, my third choice is Platoon.
Oh.
And the reason for that is, again, what we discussed earlier. It's just like how incredibly real it feels, how it's so determined to puncture any myth that war is pure heroism on either side. It's just vicious and it's nasty. And it's like the first time, I think, as a young man, when I watched it, I had seen that level of infighting within a squad of soldiers. You'd have like the viciousness of enemy versus enemy, yes. And sometimes you'd have a nuanced portrayal of Germans, for example, against Americans or whatever, but to see it inside its own squad is incredible. And Charlie Sheen, I just don't understand what happened to his career after this point, because he's incredible in it. But really, Willem Dafoe and Tom Berenger, neither of them really achieved what you would think. Looking at these three, you go, all three Oscar worthy in the film. It's absolutely incredible, so visceral, so nasty and vicious. It's and a beautifully made, iconic shots and things like that. It's just a great film. I absolutely love
it. Oliver Stone, and before he made JFK, it was after he wrote Scarface. He was fighting a drug addiction because he'd actually served. He based it on stuff he'd seen and experienced. And that's why it's surreal. And Tom Berenger, I think, is one of the most underrated actors you'll ever come across. I think, he's been in some other great stuff. He was in another one called Sniper. That's a good film. That's a very good film. And of course, he was in Inception. Didn't have much to do in Inception, but he was good at what he was doing. But he's a great actor. And I can't really say anything more about that film than you've already done, because you've said everything that needs to be said. It's one of those films that just has to be watched.
Yeah, there's the Michael J. Fox one as well, which is sort of similar in that it tries to portray like the darker side of it, but it's nowhere near. It's still a good film, but it's nowhere near. It's like one's a 10 out of 10 and one's like a good 6 or 7. But I just think if you watch one movie about Vietnam, I would say it has to be Platoon, despite the fact that there are some others that are really, really solid.
The Deer Hunter. The Deer Hunter's a good film. I've got a bit of a love-hate relationship with that film, because the point it's making could be made in an hour and a half, and yet it's a 3-hour-long film because, Michael Cimino wanted to put everything up on the screen.
They went a little bit arty-farty and with that one, and it's kind of just... I'd say just a little bit indulgent. It's still a great film, but it's a bit indulgent.
Agreed.
So, A short one on Platoon, which is perhaps a little unfair to Platoon because it is so good. But what's your third pick?
Dam Busters.
Right, okay.
A truly great British film, more than just a great war film. Very real. I mean, the first half of the movie is a science lesson. Is how are we going to get this bomb to skip across the water? Now, I came from Derbyshire, so where the dam busters practiced at Derwent Dams is still there. There's a memorial to it, and I think some of the markers are still in the water. There was a little museum, but it closed down. But I just really enjoy that film. Yes, it's very stiff upper lip. It's kind of like the antithesis of The Cruel Sea, because you've still got the realism when the Lancasters are going down at the end, but you don't get that kind of, oh, you know, Scotty got it, or, you know, I feel, because there's no time for that. It's only when they get back, and Michael Redgrave says, you know, we've lost all these men, you know, I would never have started this if I'd known that this was going to end. It's very stiff upper lippish. In fact, it's probably the most stereotypical British stiff upper lip film you've probably ever seen. But I still think it's a fantastic film, very, very well made. The cinematographer on it was the cinematographer of Star Wars. That's why it looks so similar.
Yeah.
And of course, Richard Todd as Guy Gibson. Guy Gibson was not a very nice person by all accounts. I've actually got his book here as well. There was a lot of stuff that was wrong in the first edition, but they had to put it right. He looked down on non-commissioned officers, and he was like, well, get on with it, rather than, okay, can you fix it? There was another guy called Leonard Cheshire. He had set up Leonard Cheshire Care Homes. He took over 617 Squadron after Guy Gibson. He was killed on a raid about a year after the Dam Busters raid. And he was more like how Richard Todd plays Guy Gibson. That kind of, we've got to do this, we've got to go now. I still think it's a fantastic film. I think the story behind the actual raid itself is more interesting than the film. And there's plenty of documentaries out there on YouTube. Yeah. And I still think, you know, it's a wonderful film, even though, yes, it's slightly patriotic and slightly stereotypical.
I think that it's a really, really solid film, and because the raid is so iconic that it's kind of like you must see it. And I know that they were, for the time, the special effects probably about as good as they could do and the money they had, but and it's interesting actually, the thing about cinematography, without getting too far off track. If you've seen like George Lucas's rough cut of Star Wars that he showed to potential investors, you can see that saying, we've drawn like the traces on the film and stuff like that. So it's like really similar when you're watching the Dam Busters, but you also hear some of the same lines, like how many guns do you see? Some on the tower and some on the, it's literally taking lines from each other. So it's like, it's really quite fun to see the Dam Busters. I first watched it, I must have been about 12. But I watched it again sort of maybe a year or so ago, and it is a really decent film. But I feel like it's not one thing or the other. For example, if it was a biography of what's his name, Barnes Wallace, if it was a biography of him and focused more on him, because he kind of disappears in the second half of the film. So a biography of him would be like really, really interesting, and see that willpower that he had to just keep going when he's constantly being pushed back and pushed back. I think that would have been a great film. Or to go the other way and be like an all-out action film, building up to that finale and focus more on the pilot so that there's more sense of loss as the planes are going down. So it's neither either or, but I think that what I'm describing is a degree of cynicism. And a modern film would be like, where do we get the most for our money, the most pathos for our screen time? They would probably do one or the other. And this tries to do both, which is a product of its time, where perhaps they were just a little more ambitious and a little bit more like, well, this is the story, so we'll tell it. Even if it's not as cinematic as it might be, we'll just tell it. But it is it's an epic showdown at the end. Like, I know the effects don't stand up very well at all, but it's still just one of those things. Like, this is a small group of people doing something incredibly difficult against all sorts of odds, and we know that how difficult it was because so few of them came back. And then you get like the guys that did come back and they come into their mess or whatever it's called.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm not using the right terms, but they come back
Mushroom.
and there's nobody else. There's just them. And it's just, that's when it starts to hit home that, oh, wow, these have had some major casualties here. It's been like real sacrifice here. And it does hit home. It's quite emotional to see that. For all the films, you know, like you say, it's a bit of a science lesson at the start and at the end, the special effects, you know, but you still really hits home. And you can't ask for much more from cinema than that sort of emotional resonance with it.
Exactly. And I'm just going to address this very, very briefly. The dog's name was that, and you can't change it. And they're on about doing a remake where they rename the dog. You can't do that because it's historical fact. And people saying, oh no, that name's racist. That word had no racial meaning whatsoever at that time. It was just a slang term for black. And you cannot change it. They've even taken the name of the dog off the headstone at Scampton, the air base, because they don't want to offend people. That is just wrong. You can't do it. No.
I think that anyone going to the air base to see that is going to know the context of it. And I just think you're not offending anyone but a very tiny minority that are looking for offense. So just, there comes a time, you know, I work in a university, so it's pretty politically correct, and we're always conscious of being properly worded and represented and things like that. But every now and then, you still have to just say F off when somebody complains.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Pardon my French. I'll bleep that out on YouTube. It's just, sometimes it's just the right answer.
No, yeah, you can't change it. It's like when I went for my RAF interview, I'll just put this out there. I didn't get in the RAF because of medical. I'm a really bad asthmatic. I went to Cranwell, which was the officer in aircrew training. One of the questions they actually asked was, how much do you know about the RAF? When was it formed? What are the most famous raids? What is the finest hour, which was Battle of Britain? Again, another good film. I think it focused too much on Christopher Plummer and his idiotic wife than on the actual what happened. But, you know, it's Hollywood cinema. The actual flying scenes are fantastic. 633 Squadron is another one. That actually is kind of like just a remake of the Dam Busters, only with a Mosquito. And the Mosquitoes did a lot of difficult raids. There was one called on Amiens Prison where they had to get the French resistance out, and they had to do a pinpoint strike to break them all out, and they actually managed to do it. But 633 Squadron, again, the special effects look really tacky because it's nearly 60 years old now, but it's still a good film. But, you know, that was one of the things when I was interviewed by this guy, and this guy was a little bloke. He had no presence whatsoever. I thought, is this for real? I was expecting, you know, some guy with lots of braid across his chest. And he said, why do you want to join the RF? Is this a joke? But no, I answered his questions, and then we went through the physical and all that kind of stuff. And then that's when they discovered that I was an asthmatic and I couldn't serve. And I'm like, oh, well, that's...
I feel your pain, because I also was rejected by the RAF. I was 26 and looking for a new career and applied, and my eyesight is terrible. And that's why they said, you can't. There's a couple of jobs that I could do, but there were things like stores and stuff like that. And I was just like, I'm sorry, that's not why you joined the RAF. I appreciate it, but that's not what I'm here for. You know, so I regret it, actually. I really wish that I'd just said, yeah, I'll be your storeman, and I'll be the best bloody storeman that I can be for you. But I walked away and didn't join. Yeah, my eyesight is shocking. So here we are, 2 RAF rejects in the same video stream. Was that your third choice?
That was my third choice, yeah.
Okay, so it's my second choice.
Yep.
Okay. This is one that a couple of people I've spoken to and talk about war films have gone, really? That's on your list? But I'm surprised that there's any pushback at all, because I just seem to recall it coming out in like a fanfare of what an amazing film this is. It's Black Hawk Down. And Yeah, like the whole Mogadishu thing is not glamorous in any way. The mission that they were on there was muddled and unclear, and these guys were put in an absolutely impossible position and then just like absolutely screwed over. My first exposure to it was seeing dead bodies being dragged through the streets, which I'm, ashamed to say that the BBC actually showed, because
Yes,
normally then the BBC will very much sanitize and not show dead bodies at all, even when talking about war and things. And then they showed that. I was like, that is an absolute disgrace. However, I then started to learn more about what was going on. And then there was a book, and for the life of me, I can't remember who wrote the book, who also wrote part of the screenplay of the film. And that's gone. Forget. Yeah, but the book.
I can't remember the name of the book, but I remember reading it about 20 years ago, because I can remember watching it on the news. I think it was Kate Adie or Brian Hanrahan reporting from then. And I was only about, this is 93, isn't it? So I would have been 11. I can remember it being on the news, and I remember seeing the bodies being dragged away, and Mum said, turn that off. She didn't want me to see stuff like that, even though at that time I really wanted to join up. And they said that should not be on the news at 6 o'clock at night. But I can remember, I actually saw that film when it first came out at the cinema. It was actually the first film that Tom Hardy was ever in.
Was it?
Yeah.
He's quite good in it.
Yeah, it is a good film. Even the politics around it now are still unclear. It's like, why are the Americans even there? Yeah. I mean, I know that all the peacekeeping, it was mostly a UN mission, but I think there was some sort of guerrilla attack or something, if I remember rightly, and they called in support, and that's why the Black Hawks took off.
It's a really weird one, because the mission was a peacekeeping mission, and then you go, well, why do you have American Special Forces for that? They clearly were there for something else. And then they try to capture the warlord and his lieutenants and things, and it's just like that. It's not part of a peacekeeping mission. Like the thinking behind it, I'm just not clear. But I remember at the time, anything that went on in the world, the question was then raised: what are the Americans doing about it? And you'd kind of go, well, why them and not the UN? Why not everybody? Yeah. But the difference between the book and the film, I just want to touch on, is the fact that the book tries to be realistic. So you read the book and it's got like a cast of characters of perhaps 100 people, and the film condenses that down to maybe 20. And it makes for a much greater sense of heroism involved in what they actually then go through. So the book's more realistic, I think, but the film is far more entertaining and has much more connection with those characters, because a lot of them are what you'd call a composite, like a lot of people's jobs put into one guy. Yeah. But it's still a fair reflection, I think, of just how awful, what an absolutely horrible thing that it was. That, again, for both sides, like the casualties were ridiculous, awful, like amount of wastage and things like that. But there's only two things about the film that I said I don't particularly like. One is Ewan McGregor. I think he's kind of terrible in it. Yeah. And the other one is that they made the decision with the RPGs, like the descriptions of the people that were there was that the sky was literally full of these things. They're crisscrossing in the air trying to get the helicopters down. It's completely random when one was actually hit by one. But in the film, they made it look like it was a deliberate, carefully aimed like shot. And I just think they're much more spectacular cinematically to see like the missiles go boom, boom, boom like that, and like how dangerous that would be to be the pilot. But I think it does it's a good film. The score's good. I think that the portrayal of the two that won Purple Hearts, the two special forces that went in to protect Duran, is like, is fitting, I think. So I just think it's like a really great, and we talked about Tom Berenger and how perhaps his career didn't take off. I always love watching. Mine's completely failing me today. The guy that drives the convoy. Tom Sizemore. Yes. I love watching him on screen, and I just can't understand why he's not gone on to be like more of a cat. Yeah, I know, but he just was. Yeah. He was. Whatever he was in, I was always like, this is going to be a good cinematic experience to watch this guy. He's just had so much presence and something about him that was just captivating. So he's like a great performance from him. I really enjoy the film.
Yeah.
and
I think it's because Ridley Scott directed it. It's got that kind of feel that the Gladiators got with the opening battle when the helicopter crashes and you just feel that the bullets whizzing past. It's got that kind of feel to it. And I mean, Ridley Scott is kind of hit and miss, especially in the last 20 years. But when he was making things like Alien and Blade Runner, and it was at the top of his game, he kind of managed to lift his game up again to do Gladiator and that.
Yeah.
You get really immersed in that world because he's a very visual director, so he likes that kind of detail in the background. It's a very, very harrowing film to watch. I do remember watching it on the news, as you were saying.
Yeah, that was particularly awful, frankly, from the BBC to show that when they did. Very disrespectful. Yeah. So shall we move on? I guess we're up to your second choice.
My second choice is one we talked a little bit about and why you didn't include it because it doesn't have a battle scene, but I will put it in there. It's The Great Escape.
Okay.
I think it's, again, true story. Again, I've got the book downstairs. I didn't forgot to bring it up. It's kind of like that classic men on a mission thing. It was that point in the 50s and 60s when war films stopped becoming about the war and more about entertainment. Yes, it's based on a true story, and yes, what actually happened did happen, but it's very kind of like, oh, this is all like a jolly wheeze. We're in a prison camp and we're going to try and escape, and but you actually see how they do it, and things like Charles Bronson when he's claustrophobic and he's having to dig out the tunnel. That feels very, very real.
It does for me because I'm claustrophobic, so I was like, oh my god, that guy would have to do that. Yeah.
And the best bit was Charles Bronson actually was claustrophobic and he was a minor.
Okay. What I find interesting about The Great Escape actually is that for my generation, it was on at Christmas in the UK like every year, and it became like a Christmas movie. And I think that people kind of had this, oh, it's a Christmas movie. Certainly in my generation, like all of my friends would say the same thing. It's like, oh, that's on again at Christmas, and didn't actually sit down and watch it when they were old enough to fully appreciate that it is not just a good film, but an incredible film. Just like absolutely brilliant from beginning to end. The performances and again the ending. You say like, oh, jolly. Let's have a jolly wheeze of escaping from this prison camp. That feeling is definitely there. But then when you find out that like 3 of them made it out, it's like, oh yeah, perhaps the light-hearted tone of the beginning sort of makes that finale even more impactful.
Yeah. Especially when Gordon Jackson and Richard Attenborough, they got out of the truck and they start talking, and then they look over and they've set up the machine gun and they know what's going to happen to them. And the thing that gets me is that they don't react and go like they would now in a modern film. They just look at it and go, this is the fate we're going to get because of this. And it hits harder because of that. But yeah, I mean, Steve McQueen, the reason why he wanted to be in the film is so he could ride his motorbike. And he was really, really irritated about the fact that Richard Attenborough and James Garner were upstaging him. Apparently he was difficult to get on with. Because he was kind of like, well, I'm the big Hollywood star. Why am I being upstaged? Why am I not getting all of this kind of attention and all that sort of stuff? And so they actually put the motorbike chase in just to shut him up. And so the motorbike chase was not actually part of the escape, but he wanted that in just to make him happy.
Okay, well, it worked. I mean, I think he most definitely is the lead of the film for all whatever complaining he was doing, whatever issues he had. He's still most definitely the lead of the film. Everyone comes away remembering the Gawler King. It's, you particularly, I think. I don't want to dox you or anything, but it's just, it's a great character, a great performance, but it is an ensemble thing as well. It's important to, recognise it.
Well, the guy who plays Virgil Hilts was a real American pilot. For anybody who's not seen the film, I should just explain that the people in this prison camp are all the top escapers, and they're all basically pilots and air crew because they're the ones who have to go behind enemy lines to fly the missions and so and it's basically the people who've been shot down on missions who've escaped from the plane before it crashes, who get put in these prison camps. There's another film called The Colditz Story. It was directed by Guy Hamilton. It was in the 50s, and it tells the true story of Colditz. And of course, there was the TV show with David McCallum. And of course, David McCallum's in The Great Escape. So yeah, they moved all of these guys who were the top escapers. Douglas Bader was actually one of them. If you reach for the sky, he kept escaping. So they took away his legs because he was the legless pilot. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And they put him in Stalag Luft 3. He wasn't in the film for whatever reason, but he was there as well. And Bartlett is a composite character. I can't remember the name of the guy. He was actually Big X. But again, Richard Attenborough just plays him perfectly. He's virtually word for word.
How did your father feel about it as an ex-military man?
He enjoyed it. He said that it's a little bit too cinema, but in terms of the way that people are portrayed, he liked it. He liked the fact that even in the prison camp, the chain of command was still the same. You still have the group captain at the top. You had Bartlett, who was a squadron leader. I think he was a wing commander, and I think the real guy was a wing commander. So, that kind of military, yes, sir, you're going to plan it, and that sort of thing still happened. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, he enjoyed it, and he said it was pretty realistic. He had a few things to say about another film that I'm going to talk about, but I'll come to that in a bit.
Are we going to get to my first pick then?
Go for it.
This isn't just my favourite war film. This is right up there in terms of my favourite films of all time. Yep. And it is pure spectacle. Again, like The Great Escape, amazing cast of people that, if not household names at the time, certainly went on to be. And it's a bridge too far. And I just absolutely love every aspect of it. For me, it is the quintessential war movie, the blueprint for making a war movie. The fact that it gives you, this is our mission. Edward Fox, brilliant. Well, this is our mission. Chaps, we're going in to give Hitler a bloody nose. And then he details, we're going to take this bridge, we're going to take this bridge, we're going to take this bridge, and this is why it's going to put us right where we want to be. We're going to have a chance of ending the war before Christmas, which is a cliche. But you have a clear idea of what's going on, which then becomes absolutely necessary because what happens is incredibly complex and the cast is huge and all the little things going on sort of all feed into each other. Amazing battle sequences, particularly on the bridge, but some real moments of just like pure character. I love the guy that carries the umbrella. Why do you carry the umbrella? Because I can't remember the password. And no German's going to be carrying an umbrella in this battlefield. So that you'll know that I'm legit. And when the Germans say, we want to discuss surrender, and the paratroopers outnumbered like 1,000 to 1 go, we don't have the facilities to take you all prisoner. We'd like to, but we can't. And I'm just like in fits of hysterics, having just watched all these people being killed. It's just like that flip between like the emotional hit of characters you genuinely care about dying, and then like this sort of these people finding humor in a situation. You compare that scene with the prisoners with the berets. The guy runs for the canister of berets, but he doesn't know they're berets. But they're so desperate for ammunition. He sees the supply drop, runs for it, is killed bringing it back, and then you see wasted his life trying to get some berets. Why in God's name are they dropping berets anyway? Who knows? But it's incredibly powerful. It's an amazing movie. I have at work a picture of Elliot Gould chomping on a cigar above my desk because I love this movie so much, and particularly Elliot Gould, who's not in any of those key moments, but is still an incredible presence on screen in the film, like so many are. I absolutely love it.
Yeah, absolutely agreed. Fantastic film. I watched it on my birthday, actually. It's a bit of a tradition. I always watch it on my birthday because I watched it with my dad when I was about 10. Right. And it was a birthday treat, and he said it's your first proper adult grown-up war film. It's the scene where they're paddling across the river, saying "Hail Mary, Mother of God," and they're trying to get. They don't even have any proper oars, and those boats are not bulletproof.
Yeah.
And once they reach the other side, there's like 20 people left alive out of 200. Yeah, that absolutely grips you, and Robert Redford is perfect in that moment. Same with James Caan when he finds the officer who's actually still alive. I think that was a real event. He actually did find an officer, and he did hold a gun to the doctor and said, "You're going to treat him." Yeah, the book was by Cornelius Ryan, who also wrote The Longest Day. And yes, it's a fact book and it's realistic, but it really draws you in. The language that it uses really grabs you. The part with Sean Connery where he shoots the guy through the window, again, is a real event. He really did shoot the guy. Major Urquhart is the highest ranked officer to ever shoot another person in that war.
Right. I actually have his book on the Arnhem raids. So, yeah, it's not a bad read. So
try and track that down.
Like you say, the thing about the boats and even the gliders that they use that just sort of get them in, it's like this was sort of a shoestring, a bit of a balls up in terms of the logistics of it. Yeah. But then you dumped all these guys in and go, now sort it out. And you really see, clearly that happens quite a lot in armies in the war, whatever conflict it is, like, just make the best of what you can, because if you don't, you're going to die. Yeah. And then you see the guys like, well, how do we do this? How do we get out of this? How do we sort of still push on to our objectives when we've got 80% of our unit is lying in the water back there? It's just... Yeah. Like even the paratroopers coming down, the Polish, Gene Hackman in a very strange role for him to be... Yeah, but
that was a bit of an odd one.
Yeah, I still love Gene Hackman in it because I love him in everything. He's just got, again, like we talked about with Berenger and Sizemore, real presence whenever he's on screen. Is just captivating. But yeah, Stranghorn. But his troops, absolutely, he's just screwed over big time. Like delayed and delayed and delayed and delayed, and then dropped in a position where they were obviously going to have horrific casualties. So it doesn't gloss over anything. It is a teeny bit, there's not quite as visceral as this opening of Saving Private Ryan. And you do see the field hospitals later on with all the casualties and things. So it is kind of sort of halfway between that and sort of the John Wayne bang, bang, down they fall. But it's still, it's so just gloriously epic in its scope. Every shot is a feast for the eyes as well. It's just, I just absolutely love every part of it. I could watch it again right now.
Yeah, it's also the scene where they're all parachuting out and you just see hundreds and hundreds of parachutes just ending slowly. Yeah. Richard Attenborough's attention to detail is amazing. I think, again, he was there. I think he was one of the troops that was actually serving there. But the actual story of it, yes, they secured, I think it was 8 of the 9 bridges. They didn't get the last one, which was the bridge over Arnhem. It kind of feeds into the Battle of the Bulge and Patton. Patton's a choice that I absolutely love that film, but it's kind of a bit dominated by the fact that it's a character study rather than a straight-up war film. George C. Scott's Patton. Patton was a really controversial figure. He believed that he was descended from Roman emperors and conquerors. In fact, this plays a lot into the other guy called Omar Bradley, who was the other big general. He believed that Patton was a man out of time and that he was an absolute conqueror. He was not a nice person at all, apparently. He really did slap a soldier who was suffering from PTSD. He said, "You are a coward, you're going to go back to the front," and it's played out in the film. The opening of the film is basically in North Africa, and it's Patton versus Rommel. If you ever watched The Desert Rats, it was the Americans' response to that, because Montgomery was in North Africa as well against Rommel. Yeah. And all these films kind of lead on from each other, even though they're made by different studios and stuff. And then he goes to Italy, which is the scene where he slaps the soldier. And you can see he's a brilliant general. He's a brilliant military mind. But as a person, he's just an absolute bastard.
I think that in terms of his generalship, I kind of had this feeling that a little bit like the Germans, he's kind of a proponent of blitzkrieg, of combined forces, like absolutely powering and speed and speed and speed. But when he's then asked to do, okay, you've reached your supply limit, you're going to have problems, isn't then necessarily capable of changing to a plan B as well as he might. And I think that is portrayed in the film reasonably well, but the thing about the film is much more about the character and the performance of George C. Scott. is remarkable. He was something like, I think he was 44, George C. Scott, when he did the film, whereas Patton was about 58 to 60, because it takes across a number of years. So Patton was much older than him, but he's like gravelly, and you could see why people would like him, even based on the performance. You could see why people would rate Patton and like to be in his army. He's got, not on the same sort of scale, but that sort of Gordon Ramsay, you might be shouting at me, demeaning me and calling me an arsehole, but I'll prove you wrong. And then your praise when I do something right will mean 10 times as much. So I think that there's that sort of response would be what a lot of people would have to him. And a few others as well would just be like, fuck this dude, I want out of here. Because he's just such an arsehole with it. Very, very, very exacting. But, it's war. People are going to die if you don't. But there's also those controversies. I mean, the film is a bit fast and loose with the truth in Sicily, particularly. I think doesn't quite play out like that in reality, but it's still a little bit of poetic license, dramatic license, a little bit of tweaking of the facts to play that character for what it is. I think is still perfectly a reasonable thing to do, as long as we know it's entertainment, and it is great entertainment as films go. The one thing I would say, which I would give The Bridge Too Far the edge over Patton, is that a lot of Patton's war scenes are just that. There isn't really any concept of what is the goal here. There isn't, we'll take that bridge, and then we'll be on the free and run to this. There isn't that, particularly the first one where he engages Rommel's troops. It's just two groups of troops walking at each other, and you're like, then they kill each other. And you don't quite have that, I care about any of these soldiers. And right up until that one guy dies, which is like his lieutenant, and then it's like, oh, okay, that's quite, then there's a bit of payoff. But before that, it's just a lot of fighting of people we don't know anything about. Yeah. So
there's no context to it. It's all just action because it's action. And Patton died in mysterious circumstances. He got run over by a cart just after the end of the war, after basically insulting the Russians. He was a guy who just could not keep his mouth shut.
Yeah.
And he just said exactly what he thought. And that didn't endear him to the brass very much, people like Eisenhower. So that's why they kind of sent him to places where, okay, there's a big battle, go and win it for us, rather than actually having something logistically to do with it.
There is definitely that post-war. I think some of his comments were particularly controversial. Yes. And you see a lot of biographers and things would be like, oh, you had a head injury, it was talking nonsense. And it's like, I'm not sure I subscribe to that. I don't, I'm no historian, but I just think that in his mind, being the warrior that he is, related to conquerors, in his mind, that he would see the Germans as a worthy opponent, a little bit like the Roman historians do. They would then build up their enemy to make themselves look that much stronger. And I think that he would buy into that and say these Germans were worthy adversaries. They were strong, powerful men that I have defeated. And that in his mind would then make him like the Germans more than the Germans' adversaries, people that the Germans had conquered, which is why he would come out and say something anti-Semitic. He may have said that before the war or not, I'm not so sure about, but I think his post-war comments and the fact that he kept Nazis in their roles when the Americans were saying, get them out, and his dislike of the Russians, for example, I think just forms part of that lionization of the opponent that he fought. Maybe I'm talking nonsense. I don't know, but that's how I view it.
Yeah. The other thing about it, and this is a really good bookend to it, is George C. Scott won the Oscar for Best Actor, and he refused it because he said the Oscars are like a meat market, and I'm not interested, which is a very Patton thing to say.
Yeah, he said in other interviews as well that I'm not in competition with other actors, which you can kind of go like Patton himself would not see that as a worthy contest to be judged on that thing. It would be blood and guts. He kind of in the film he says, without war, what the hell have I got? Paraphrasing. Yeah. He's born to fight. He's born to be in a war. And in some respects, you might go, well, it's quite kind of fitting that he would die in 1945 then, rather than be less useful human being. His usefulness is in the war. But it was also interesting that they wouldn't send him to the Pacific. And I wonder again if the theatre of the Pacific does not lend itself to what we talked about, like the blitzkrieg combat, which is very much his forte. So I wonder if they had reservations about whether he'd be as effective in that theatre. But I think there's no doubt that he would have commanded the loyalty of whatever men he was leading.
Oh, yeah.
Very charismatic figure.
Well, the war in the Pacific was just blood, sweat, and toil. It was, well, let's get like 10 yards of land off the Japanese. Sands of Iwo Jima. I mean, yes, it's a very old film. It's a John Wayne film, but it doesn't actually play into that kind of John Wayne, gung ho, all that kind of stuff. He's really unlikable in that film, but he gets the results. But you kind of get the feeling that yes, this is kind of what it would be like, even though it's end of 1940s. I think that film was made, but you do get the feeling that this was kind of like the trench warfare in the First World War, that it's just going to take forever to win just an island.
There's less war films made, I think, about the Pacific. It seems to be, perhaps it's changing now, but it's like less glamorous part of the war for whatever reason. For example, Band of Brothers is an incredible TV show, but the Pacific one that they made after it just didn't get the same sort of level of attention and just wasn't quite as interesting as that. What's the Andrew Garfield film? That's set in that part.
Oh, that was pretty good. But again, you can tell compared to actors from two or three generations before, it's the feeling is not the same. He's saying yes, sir, but there's no kind of immediacy to it.
Is it Vince Vaughn that plays the drill instructor? He's pretty good, but I was kind of like the whole time going, I'd rather see Lee, I can't remember his name, Emery, in this role. I know he'd been too old for it, or probably even dead by that point, but just somebody with a bit more gravitas, a bit more experience of it. Somebody like Harvey Keitel, who was a Marine, for example, would have done a much better job, I think. Maybe a little too old himself by that point.
It's a shame, but we will never know. But I do prefer the older war films to the modern ones. Yes, the filmmaking now is better and the special effects and the editing are better, but you get that real gritty, grounded feeling. I mean, I've gone on about this before elsewhere. If you watch something like Dirty Harry or The French Connection, you compare it to a cop movie made now. There's no grittiness, there's no urgency, there's none of that feeling of, this is a serious situation and it needs to be dealt with now.
I can't really remember the last time I went to the cinema and was absolutely blown away. And I'll mention the one film that sort of strikes me as being like a modern film that really, really was like captivating and sort of brought me back to the magic and love of cinema I had as a younger man, and that was Inception. But if we take Inception, and because it's not a war movie, we just sort of skate over it. What did you make of Dunkirk?
I liked it, but I felt it was quite lacking. The thing that I found was the beach scenes. It's like, well, where is everybody? There's meant to be 350,000 people here, and these beaches are empty. I liked the fact that it was quite immersive. I mean, they did it for real with the Spitfires and things like that, but there was no feeling of immediacy. There was nothing. I mean, the scene where the destroyer sinks after it's loaded up, yes, okay, but that was just one scene in a film that was nearly 2 hours long. But apart from that one scene, I didn't feel, like we need to get these guys away from here. Apart from at the very end when Tom Hardy's taken away from the burning Spitfire. Again, it's a set piece, but there's no actual. It felt like watching Tenet. Tenet was a film that I really wanted to look forward to because I love Christopher Nolan. But when I actually watched it, it was like, well, he's got to go and talk to this guy, then he's got to go and talk to this guy, then he's got to go and talk to this guy. There's no. Compare that with Inception, where we know what's going on within the first 5 minutes and it builds and builds and builds. Dunkirk just felt a little bit flat.
I agree with you in terms of the lack of spectacle, the lack of scale of it means that it's not really a reflection of what happened. What you should have had was shots of the beaches like littered with boats being loaded up. You should have had like the skies full of aeroplanes, the beaches like lines and lines of men, but also that conflict away from the beach of buying them time. That's basically the heroic sacrifice. If you read that part, you know you're not getting away from there. You're just helping others to do that. So there wasn't any pathos, there wasn't any scale, there wasn't any, just that it really lacked oomph. And for me, you know, you'd mentioned about the Destroyer, but the thing about the Destroyer and the fact that it was there for so long and didn't actually do much of what you would call moving sort of betrayed for me the fact that it was a set and that it was built and it was, you know, they were trying to make the most of a limited budget in that regard. It sort of showed the weakness of the film. But I just, none of the characters either sort of grabbed me and made me go, I really care what happens to this person. It just was across the board really quite flat and very disappointing.
Yeah, agreed. But if you compare it with the scene in Enigma with Kate Winslet, when they actually have the scene in Dunkirk, it's only for a couple of minutes, but the beach is rammed with people. And that scene really just grabs you and it's like, oh, okay, this is why they're doing the thing at Bletchley Park. It's to stop things like this from happening. There was a lot more going on in that film.
You know that Dunkirk would have been absolutely a desperate situation for hundreds of thousands of people, and there never is that feeling of it. Before we move on to your final pick, what about 1917 in terms of more recent war movies?
See, that was the complete opposite because you were completely immersed in it. Now, there's not very many films about the First World War, and that was made by Sam Mendes, wasn't it?
Yeah.
He's a director with a bit more visual oomph, even though it's more emotional. I felt really invested in that, especially the scene where he's running towards the camera and the camera's moving back and you just see the battle going off on either side. And you felt like you were in the middle of that. And again, you were feeling like, this is somewhere I do not ever want to be. Both of my great-grandparents were at the Somme, so they both refused to talk about it. And from that feeling, you kind of got the feeling of, this is why they didn't want to talk about it. I felt that it sort of went a little bit flat towards the end. The opening was better than the ending, kind of like a bit like Saving Private Ryan. But overall, I thought it was a good film.
Yeah, I thought it was a very solid sort of 7-ish out of 10 movie, but it did work better, I felt, than Dunkirk, partly because of it was so focused on a much more limited group of people that you get much more invested in what happens to them. There were certain bits of it on a technical point of view that I'm watching, like you see somebody shooting from that side and a squib going off this side of a rail. It said, well, that would actually be punching a hole through that. It would still hit the guy if that's where it was hitting. So it was kind of little things like that they did for like to show, I don't know, whatever you wouldn't call it realism because it was quite the opposite, but to try and make it feel like dramatic and close. But it's just, you could have done that by punching a hole through that girder or whatever it was and seeing it go past the guy. It didn't have to just be a squib because the squib looks trash when it's that side and it's the wrong side to the gun. So, but other than that, like little nitpicking, it is a good, solid film.
One film that I will say was good was Darkest Hour with Gary Oldman as Winston Churchill.
Right.
And it's kind of like the political side of it for Dunkirk and the Battle of Britain, and you actually get inside Churchill's head. I thought that was really good because, of course, I love Gary Oldman as an actor. But I mean, it wasn't so much focused on the war side of things. It was more like the corridors of power and the decisions he has to make. And I really enjoyed that.
We've got only one pick left, which is your number one.
Yeah, I mentioned it right at the top.
Tell me what it is.
Where Eagles Dare. Just a piece of pure cinematic entertainment. Just as a piece of pure cinematic entertainment, it's just absolutely wonderful. I love it. Yes, it's overwritten. Yes, it's like, oh, put the bag in the bus. I mean, it's obvious he's got to do that. And it's the bit where he pulls the book out of his pocket at the end and he says, I've got this book in my pocket. Well, that's kind of obvious. It's a little bit overwritten, but it was Alistair MacLean's first attempt at a screenplay, so I can let him off. But I think the way it builds up the tension just throughout the film until you get to the point where they're in the hall and he's saying, okay, I'm actually Major Schmidt and I'm working for the SS and this is what's going on. And then Darren Nesbitt comes down the stairs and he's going, what is going on here? And then he flips again. I really like that kind of playing with conventions and screwing with people's heads. I just really enjoy it.
Be honest. Did you put this number one just to fuck with me? Because you know that I don't like that film.
I put this number one because it's genuine.
Right, okay. I'll give you it, but it's No Bridge Too Far, which was my number one pick. But it is. No. It's not that I don't like this film. What I like this film, it's a good solid 70s war film. Is it 70s or early 80s? Must be 70s.
68, I think.
Oh, it's even earlier. Right, okay. Yeah. It's a good solid war film. But I really like the book. And I really like the character that Clint Eastwood plays. But I like him in the book and not in the film, where he's completely different. In the book, he's lively. He's the Joker of the unit. And you kind of look at it in the book and go, the reason he's in this book is that if they make a film of this, he's the American, he's the Steve McQueen, he's going to be the star power that dominates our film, even if the British officers are doing the thing here and there. And then Clint Eastwood, his performance is completely different. He is absolutely unemotional through the whole thing. We've talked about this before, and I think that, he's going for I'm the stoic killer of the group.
Yes.
But it comes across to me much more, having read the book, as just a really flat and lifeless performance. And the whole time I was watching it, I was just like, I hate what they have done to this character. I hate it. So the film is good. And if I'd seen the film without reading the book, I would like it all the more. But I just absolutely hate what Clint Eastwood did. I think that's his worst film performance of his career that I've seen. There may have been some films that were worse that I haven't seen, but I really dislike it. That part of it. The rest of the film is fine. But it is good fun. It's hokum. It's not really.
It's a James Bond film for a non-James Bond audience, is what it is.
That's a great description of it, in fact.
Yeah. And what happened was, it was Richard Burton's son. He said, Dad, I don't want to see you getting killed in a film. Can't you kill some people and we can go and watch a film that you're in? So it was Richard Burton who actually set the ball rolling. And Alistair MacLean wrote the book and the film at the same time.
Right.
Yep. That's why the book and the film are identical virtually, apart from all the shooting. But Clint Eastwood, he read the script and he read, I don't want to say all these lines. He turned to Richard Burton and said, do you want to say them instead? And Richard Burton was smashed out of his head throughout the whole filming. And he said, yeah, I'll say it. It's fine. So he just condensed everything down to, yep, nope, yep. Nope.
That just backs up my idea, my description that he phoned it in. He couldn't be bothered, rather than he put in a thoughtful, slightly different take on a character that MacLean created. He just couldn't be bothered. That's how it comes across to me. And that description of it, even if it doesn't fully corroborate what I think, sort of does, can be seen as backing up. But it is decent. I do like it. There's enough spectacle and oomph that actually, in terms of, you compare it to the Bond films of the time, if it was late 60s, it's probably better than what the Bond films of the time were, allowing for the fact that Sean Connery is incredibly watchable as Bond. It's just a bit more lively and a bit better done. Perhaps they just had more money for it, which is a surprise, given. But then Fleming's books, they weren't that big a success. They were popular, but they weren't that big a success until the films started being made, and then the sales went up. So they were successful, yes, but perhaps that's why the Bond films just didn't have as much money as perhaps. But again, if you're saying that this was MacLean's first screenplay, that's a hell of a punt to spend a lot of money on a first screenplay.
I mean, he was already an established writer at the time, because he'd written HMS Ulysses and the Guns of Navarone. And again, you could argue that the Guns of Navarone is a better book. It's certainly a better film than Where Eagles Dare. in terms of actually the way it's made and perhaps the way it's constructed. But in terms of just pure entertainment, Where Eagles Dare is my top choice because I just enjoy it so much.
Right.
And again, my dad, he took one look and he said, "That's ridiculous. That's stupid. You don't land with a parachute like that. No, you don't hold a gun like that. No, you don't stab someone like that. No." It was the part in the corridor where he's got the 2 machine guns, and he just went, "Oh, off. This is bollocks." And I said, "Dad, are you enjoying this film?" And he said, "Oh yeah, it's complete. It's just a load of old crap. I mean, there's no way you can fire 2 machine guns like that. No." And my uncle, who was also in the army, it was one of those horrible, cold, snowy days. The both of them sat there just picking this film apart, going, "That's wrong. That gun's wrong. No, that machine gun's wrong. No, they didn't have that kind of bus. No, they didn't have that. No, they would be shot on sight for being spies because they were wearing Nazi uniforms. That's wrong." You know, they just pulled it apart completely. But myself and my cousin, we just looked at each other and said, "We're really enjoying this."
You might have enjoyed it all the more for the fact that it's causing the older generation so much grief, I think.
Because Dad was a long-term military guy, he watched war films and he just picked them apart. He just said, "Oh, that gun's wrong. That tank's wrong." The tanks in Bridge Too Far are Patton tanks. They're not actual Shermans or Panzers, so they're completely wrong. But he would point out things like that. But he had a real thing about, this isn't right. That's not the way you march. That's not the way you have your beret on your head. No. And I mean, if he'd been a technical advisor on a film, it would have been the director's worst nightmare because he would have just picked apart everything.
Taken 3 more years to get the thing done as they're waiting for the right hats to come in and things.
Yeah.
But they should get that sort of thing right to an extent. I mean, I think particularly in the generation we're talking about with Where Eagles Dare, they just didn't give a toss about how realistic it was. It's just like, what have we got for the money we're spending? So there's that. But I do think that they should, when you're making a war film, unless it's something like Three Kings where it's obvious nonsense. But if you're making something that actually was sort of even based on a true story, then you have a debt, I think, to the people that did those things to get it at least a little bit right.
Yeah.
To do your best to try.
The director himself, he even admitted as much that he put the 2 machine guns in just for a laugh, and he put a helicopter in when they hadn't been invented to that extent yet, and stuff like that. He did it deliberately, and he did it even more in Kelly's Heroes because it's the same guy who directed Kelly's Heroes. Now, my dad actually enjoyed Kelly's Heroes because he said there is a Donald Sutherland in every tank battalion, and he really does act like that. And the scene where he's sitting around drinking wine and eating cheese is so accurate, it's painful because people actually did that waiting for something to happen.
That's another fun film. And Donald Sutherland's another actor that just whatever he's in is elevated by his mere presence. So I do quite like to see that film when it comes on the TV or whatever. I do like to sit down and watch it. It's mostly because of him, but he's so always got some sort of quirky thing going on with whatever character he's playing. But in that one is good fun.
But yeah, that is my top choice, and no word of a lie, Where Eagles Dare is my favourite. It's partly because of the experience of watching it as a kid with my dad and my uncle and my cousin, and partly because it's just a great fun film to sit through. I mean, it's probably not historically accurate. For a fact, it's not historically accurate. And you compare it to stuff like Patton, it falls down flat on its face. But that is the film I've had the most fun watching as a war film, just because of the experience of it.
I will give you that for the bonding you had in your family, that's a worthy entry of that's number one. I'm happy enough for you to pick it, even despite all the things that I said about it.
I mean, I'll put my hand up to it. The first book that I wrote that you helped me edit, that is just basically a little retread of Where Eagles Dare. It's 2 guys on a mission. They're trying to find who the traitor is within the RAF. You know, it's a modern spin on it of a similar kind of story. That's all it is.
I think that you probably should, at this point, mention what your book is called and where people can get it.
Okay, it's not yet for sale. It's going to be coming out on 13th of June next year. It's going to be called Hard Pursuit by Barrie Taylor, myself. You can get it on Amazon and any good online stockist. In fact, here is a first draft manuscript of my 3rd book. This is how I write them. I write the first draft longhand, and then I type them up afterwards and add the detail and stuff. That's how I do it with all of the books.
That's
because
how
I just find I just find it a good way to write, because it's a good way to get ideas down. I think just typing into a laptop, you kind of lose track and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's if you've got a piece of paper, you can go back to it and go, oh, okay, yeah, no problem. Whereas if you've got a computer, you've got to scroll back through and scroll back through. And having read Sexton Lovecraft, because you sent me an early copy of it, you've got a really similar way of putting the story together. Quite frankly, I think you're a better writer than me.
That's so kind.
Well, honestly, I do. I think you're a better writer than me, because I think that the world you create is a lot more weird. It just clicks together a lot better.
It's a lot weirder. I would, when we discussed yours, when I first read it, I said that you were in that sort of Chris Ryan, Andy McNab bracket of there's a degree of realism, is a degree of realism in the character of the situation, and it's like hard-boiled, proper, action-packed. Your real strengths are in those action scenes. I think that there is a market for taking the Andy McNab, the Chris Ryan, and being just a little bit more of that 70s throwback to the people that Alistair MacLean, Desmond Bagley, Hammond Innes, the people that were sort of post-war and into the 60s and 70s that sort of went around what was still an empire at the time. And I think that there's not that yours is set in that era. I'm just saying that energy, that vibrancy, that this tough man that if his Land Rover breaks down will fix it sort of guy, rather than like modern men, or even a modern car, you got no chance. But
quick.
Yeah, there's like a throwback energy even in a very modern, because you deal with like the modern side of the technology of this. You clearly, from what we've talking to you right now in the videos, you clearly do an awful lot of research into this thing. Part of it is obviously your family history as well, moves you to do that. But on your YouTube thing as well, you visited the air shows and things and posted clips of that. So it's quite clearly a passion for you to get those things right. And it gives it a real degree of realism as well. So I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's not necessarily a genre that I read a lot of. So the fact that I did enjoy your book says something, I think, that it is a bit of a cut above. I hope so. Anyway, when it comes out, that it finds a really good audience that appreciates it.
They actually bought the second book as well. The second book is slightly different.
Right.
It's called Blind Corner, and it's a murder mystery set on one of the RAF bases, and that's going to be coming out next November the 7th, I think, off the top of my head. And it's slightly different because I wanted to do something different, and Karen challenged me to do something else. And it's much more, you get to see the other character who's perhaps not the guy who's going to fix his car. He's the guy who's going to think the way through the case. And they said, we're going to print this as well. There are 6 others in the series.
You've written all of them already?
I've not sold all of them already, no. This is the 3rd book. This is more of a motor racing. It's kind of a bit more of a pat on the back to myself because I love my motor racing. It's basically they've got to go undercover as a race team because there's some nasty criminals who've taken over a race team and they're using that to import stuff into Britain, and they've got to stop them. So
that feels Desmond Bagley to me. Like it's got a sort of spoilers, running blind sort of vibe of the undercover doing spoilers. They pretend to be a film crew and it's in Afghanistan and things. So it's just like it's just like I could feel the vibe already. So I think that'd be great as well. Hopefully this has been entertaining and you've enjoyed our picks. Leave your picks in the comments if you wish. Thank you very much to Barrie. Look out for his book next year in June. Thanks, Barrie, for coming on. I'll speak to you again soon.
No problem.
Bye.
Thank you.